Imagine a world that is economically, socially, and environmentally sustainable. This is Agenda 2030, which includes 17 Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, aimed at ending poverty, protecting the planet, and ensuring prosperity for all. The International Comparison Programme, or ICP, is helping to make these ambitious goals a reality by providing crucial data to governments and agencies to help design and monitor their policies. The only way to know if we're achieving the SDGs is to measure progress within and across countries. And doing this starts with something as small as a bag of rice. Measuring the cost of rice here, and around the globe becomes data that can be used in countless ways. Just like that bag of rice, the ICP started small as a modest research project at the University of Pennsylvania in 1968, led by Irving Kravis, Alan Heston, and Robert Summers. The goal of the ICP was to set up a regular program of worldwide economic comparisons. The ICP's first report was published in 1970 and compared just 10 countries. Since then, the ICP has become the largest statistical partnership in the world, with the participation of about 200 countries and 20 global, regional, and sub-regional agencies. Through its relationships with participating countries, the ICP collects data on the prices of thousands of goods and services around the world. This data is used to estimate purchasing power parities, or PPPs. PPPs are the measurement used to compare the relative size of economies and the levels of material well-being. Being able to compare the relative welfare of people in real terms across and within countries helps policymakers, researchers, and businesses make decisions in the areas of poverty and inequality, labor and productivity, climate and energy, trade and competitiveness, education, and healthcare. An important goal of the ICP has been to work with participating countries to help improve the quality of their data and statistics. These mutually beneficial partnerships result in more precise PPP numbers, but also improve the data used for policymaking and planning within countries. Though the ICP started small, its growth over 50 years has taken it from a modest research project to a permanent global program, from 10 participating countries to nearly 200. A worldwide, collaborative effort that is key to monitoring progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. The International Comparison Programme, 50 years and counting.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us at this special event celebrating the 50th anniversary of the International Comparison Program, or ICP. This event is streaming on World Bank Live in English. You can also follow it on Twitter with the hashtag ICP50TH. My name is Nada Hamadeh, and I will be your MC today. The ICP started in 1968 as a small joint venture between the United Nations and the University of Pennsylvania. 10 countries participated in the program at its inception. 50 years later, the ICP is the largest global data program led by the World Bank under the auspices of the United Nations in partnership with 20 multilateral agencies and with the participation of around 200 countries. To celebrate this anniversary, we are joined today by World Bank Chief Executive Officer, or CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, who will deliver the opening remarks at today's event. As the bank CEO, Kristalina's role is to build support across the international community to help mobilize resources for poor and middle-income countries and develop more effective solutions for the poor at the scale required. Kristalina is a global champion for gender, climate, poverty eradication, and humanitarian efforts. She helped shape the agenda of the European Union, first as Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response, and later as Vice President for Budget and Human Resources. Please join me in welcoming Kristalina.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nada. Welcome to all in the audience. It is my privilege to speak to you today, and since I was presented as somebody who is marshalling to mobilize more resources so we can address development needs, it brings memory from the spring meetings when we have been successful to get $13 billion of capital increase for IBRD and IFC because our shareholders trust us. And one very important reason they trust us for is because our work is evidence-based. It is based on making data speak up for development. Then data we know can change people's lives. When we provide farmers in Africa with data on commodity prices, they can bargain and get a higher price for their products. And then they can send their children to school, they can buy fertilizers and tools, they can improve their productivity, grow more crops. Data gives voice to people in the high corridors of power. And data also allows us to create images that impact how policymakers think. When I was Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid, I would speak very loudly for resilience to climate change and the necessity to integrate in policies climate action. And I would always use a very clean, powerful graph. The graph had the impact of climate in terms of reduction of availability of grass for the animals, and how animals over time would go down in size in the livestock of local people. So they would go from cows to goats to sheep. And as the size of the animals in the livestock goes down, people living in extreme poverty go up. Every time I put this graph on a screen or give it in the hands of a minister or prime minister, it would have the immediate impact of recognizing the criticality of making economies, societies more resilient. So here today we celebrate a 50th anniversary of the International Comparison Program, a massive undertaking to provide this data that allows policymakers and citizens to make more informed decisions. Angus Deaton and Alan Heston wrote in 2009, over the last 30 years, more and better data have fundamentally changed the practice of both microeconomics and macroeconomics. No new data have been more important and more influential than those from the International Comparison Program. How many of you in this room, in this audience, are associated with the International Comparison Program? Raise your hand. All the power to you. Bravo. Well done. So let me just make three very simple, straightforward points how this work of International Comparison Program makes development and economics work better. First, and very, very important, it helps countries benchmark their progress themselves and then compare to each other. And that comparison is a dramatically strong force to leap forward. Purchasing power parities, foundation of every country's work to understand where and how they fit in the world economy, how they compare to their neighbors and trade partners. And that may be a kind of a boring example, but 2014, the last round of results on purchasing power parity caused a frenzy in the media of predicting when China is going to be the largest economy. The second very important power of data underpins our twin goals: eradicating extreme poverty, boosting shared prosperity. Why? Because we better understand who the poor are, where they are, and what can change their prospects in life. How can an economy use the dynamism of growth in the best possible way? And three, data is a uniformly understood platform for collaboration. When we produce data, that requires collaboration. We cannot have data sparking here and there without a unifying platform of collaboration. The International Comparison Program is the largest in that field. It is a program working in 200 countries and with 20 agencies. Data makes us concentrate on what matters the most and where it is the most difficult place to work. When we take data, we understand that, yes, the world is going down in terms of extreme poverty. It used to be in '96, we had a dramatic, just over 30% of the population living in extreme poverty. Today it is around 10%, 3 times less. But my professor of statistics used to say, for the numbers that are based on average, that you can put your head in the refrigerator, your feet in the oven, your temperature would be average, but you will be dead. When we look at the disaggregated data on extreme poverty, in 12 countries, the share of people in extreme poverty is going up, 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 most likely with South Sudan holding the record from 41% just 5 years ago to over 71% today. and that focuses our attention on places like Yemen or Mali or Niger, where, to the shame of all of us, extreme poverty is going in the wrong direction. And of course, we cannot come with solutions to how we deal with the big challenges of today without relying on comparative data. We have done a lot in the last 50 years. Well, with modern medicine allowing us now to think of living to be 120, 140, 150, we will be able to regroup in a room like this, maybe in this very room, in another 50 years when we turn 100. And at that time, just imagine what this program will have achieved. So let me turn to the person who we all want to hear, to Sir Angus Deaton, a 2015 Nobel laureate in economics and highly respected scholar, Eisenhower Professor of Economics and International Affairs Emeritus at Princeton, a man that has done so much for us to be able to celebrate today, and to top it up, he has agreed to speak to us. May I invite you to please join us, Sir Angus.
Welcome. It's a huge privilege to be here today and representing many of us who've worked on the ICP. And I want to welcome you, give you my welcome to the 50th anniversary of the world's largest and most ambitious statistical program, the International Comparison Program. In this, its Jubilee year, it's certainly time to celebrate some of its achievements. Let me start by quoting something I wrote a few years ago. The rounds of the International Comparison Project are like successive Olympic Games. Like the Olympics, they do not happen every year, and in the first modern games, only a few countries sent competitors. There were only a few events, and standards of competition were relatively low. Yet, that first modern Olympics was a world changer, which eventually grew into the record-breaking professional event that it is today, in which almost all of the nations of the world come together in a truly global competition. The ICP began in 1968 with Irving Kravis, Alan Heston, and Robert Summers from the University of Pennsylvania, and Zoltan Konesi from the United Nations. The first round in 1967 had only 6 countries, with 4 more added in 1970, and prices were collected for only a small range of goods and services. Since then, each round has become bigger and better, and much more expensive. With more countries represented, with the involvement of more and more professional statisticians and economists, and with lots of proprietary training in the form of expert workshops, theoretical papers, and figuring out how to deal with problems that could not be solved in the previous round. I spent the earlier part of today in one of those meetings, so it's still going strong. The ICP has been such a success that from now on, it will be held more frequently. For now, every 3 years, with plans to go annual, and the ICP is now formally and fully established as part of the permanent international statistical architecture. Alan Heston, who is sitting here and who we will honor later, has written a fine history of the ICP and of the studies that preceded it, what you might call the history and the prehistory. I recommend that memoir to you. You can find it online on the Groningen website, along with the current version of the Penworld table. So all you have to do is Google Groningen, Alan Heston, ICP memoirs. So how did this tiny project turn into the huge enterprise that we see today? And why is it so important to the bank and to the global development community? A good place to start, and I'm sure not everybody here is an ICP aficionado, so I want to go back to the basics. A good place to start is the elementary fact that if you take a US dollar to Delhi and change it at Indira Gandhi Airport, you will get about 68 rupees. If you then take your 68 rupees out into the city, you will be able to buy almost 4 times as much as your dollar bought you in Washington, DC. So how do we compare the value of a dollar in DC and a dollar in Delhi? Given that the exchange rate gives the wrong answer, and that we would like to match purchasing power in both places, to find out, someone has to collect prices in India and to collect prices in the US so that we can calculate the Indian to US price of rice, of haircuts, of gasoline, of milk, and of 1,001 other items. These numbers then need to be averaged somehow to make them into a price index that summarizes prices in India relative to prices in the US. It is this price index, also called the purchasing power parity, exchange rate, or PPP, that does the job, not the current exchange rate. But why, apart from idle curiosity, is this price index useful? And what justifies the cost of collecting prices on thousands of goods and services in hundreds of countries around the world? Maybe exchange rates are good enough for many purposes, and for many years people thought so. And maybe the law of one price is a reasonable approximation under which exchange rates are okay. The law of one price that Alan likes to call the flaw of one price, because it doesn't work very well. A lot of the discussion about development runs in terms of comparative statements about countries. Poor countries versus rich countries, or the relative size of national economies, or which countries have more poor people. Some of these discussions can be handled pretty well using national accounts converted at market exchange rate. For example, the bank's classification of countries by income does not use PPP exchange rate, and that works okay because the ranking of countries in terms of PPPs is not very different from the ranking of countries in terms of exchange rates. But when we come to look at the size of countries, that's a very different matter. China is bigger than the US in PPP terms, but not in exchange rates. Development practitioners need to know on a daily basis what a local wage rate means compared with wage rates in other countries, for which they need to know what the local wage rate can buy. International organizations constantly need to compare living standards across countries, and more formally, if we are to have a global poverty line that applies everywhere, as is required by the Sustainable Development Goals, we need to go beyond the exchange rates that are so deeply misleading when it comes to calculating living standards across countries. Now, I'm an academic. I'm not a development practitioner. and I don't work for the World Bank. But I want to say something about the ICP from my perspective first, and then I come back to the bank. It always surprises me how little most economists know or understand about the ICP. And many seem to regard it as an essentially mechanical price collection exercise. But it is a great deal more than that, and those who dismiss it often don't understand how intellectually rich and how intellectually challenging the topic is. Price index theory is a staple of economics courses, or at least it used to be. But the standard theory applies to typically comparing two situations, like 2018 compared with 2015, or two places, say New York versus Los Angeles, or India versus China. But the ICP needs much more. Instead of bilateral price indices comparing two, it needs multilateral price indices, indexes that work for a whole bunch of countries at the same time. Which countries? Just rich ones, like the EU set of indices, or for the whole world? Do multilateral indices have a basis in consumer theory similar to the basis of bilateral indices? Exactly which prices are we supposed to compare? How do we compare a shirt in France with a shirt in Mali? Should we use the identical shirt, even though a French shirt costs a fortune in Mali and is rarely bought there? Or should we instead use a representative shirt in France and compare it to a representative but very different shirt in Mali? None of these issues is completely settled, though there's more agreement on some than on others. On some of these, Alan has been arguing about it since 1968, and we were arguing about it this afternoon. They never get solved. Many others have been worked on for a very long time. For example, Gini, which is Corrado Gini, who most of you know in an entirely different context, made an important contribution in the 1920s. The trade-offs between matching, on the one hand, and representativity, on the other hand, the shirt example, has been a challenge to the ICP since the very early days and remains so today. Thinking about all of these questions is the sort of thing that academics love to do. But these theoretical issues are easy compared to the practical ones of collecting the data and of questions like how to handle the balance of trade and how to measure what we optimistically call comparison-resistant items like housing or construction, or how to measure the extent to which Singaporean civil servants are more efficient than Congolese civil servants. All of these questions have their counterparts in national income accounting, and the work of the ICP has always been a collaboration between academics and statisticians from international organizations and from national statistical agencies responsible for domestic national accounts. And for me, at least, the highest pleasure of working on the ICP has been this collaboration between people of widely different skills and knowledge, each of whom contributes to a product that none of us could have done on our own. Or I should modify that, none of us except Alan Heston could have done on his own. While it is true that calculating PPP-based national accounts almost always has parallels in domestic national accounts, there are often unexpected differences. For example, when we calculate a domestic price index, say for 2018 relative to 2000, we know from our first-year economics class that we can use a base period weights or end period weights, giving us what are known as L'Espère's or Pasch indices. In that context, those are not usually very far apart, perhaps 5%. This is not the case for international comparisons. The ratio of the L'Espère's index to the Pasch index for China versus the US is about 1.7. For Russia, it's 1.8, and for a few African countries, it's more than 4. In his memoir, Alan tells the story of what a surprise this was at the beginning, and how Irving Kravis, about to fly back to Penn to teach, was so horrified by the L'Esperce-de-Pache difference for Italy that he canceled his flight and stayed in Paris in order to check the calculations. The ICP is full of surprises. I'd like to give 2 examples of important literatures in economic development that were made possible by the ICP. And this will bring me back to the importance of the ICP for the bank. In 1978, Kravis, Summers, and Heston published a paper in the Economic Journal which contained PPP versions of GDP for more than 100 countries. A year later, in 1979, in a paper in the Journal of Development Economics, Montek Ahluwalia, Nicholas Carter, and Hollis Chenery used those PPPs to take a poverty line drawn from Indian data to estimate poverty counts for 36 countries using the Indian line converted at PPP exchange rates. This was the beginning of the World Bank's global poverty counts. Under the later direction of Martin Ravallion and his colleagues, these counts became the famous $1 a day counts. Today, under the capable direction of Chico Ferreira, the bank's poverty analysts use a line of $1.90 per person per day. But you can trace that whole global poverty exercise back to that 1970 paper from Penn. My second example comes from the 1991 paper by Summers and Heston in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. This contained the results of Mark V of the Penn World Table, which provided estimates for up to 39 years for 138 countries. Enough data really to get to work on, and these data were the foundation for a whole new wave of empirical work on economic growth. An economic growth group was established at the National Bureau of Economic Research under Robert Barrow. Similar work flourished at the bank. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of papers were written running cross-country regressions on the determinants of economic growth. Many of these were later extended to examine whether and to what extent aid actually helped recipient countries grow more rapidly. As with all such waves, there were excesses, and in the end, a good deal of criticism of the whole idea of cross-country regressions. But that's really wrong, if only because without formal statistical analysis and a comprehensive data set, we are left with competing anecdotes about economic growth that are undisciplined by serious consideration of the empirical evidence. While these regressions have not unlocked the secrets of economic growth, nor settled the debates about the effectiveness of aid, that was too much to expect of them. But the analyses using that and later Penn World Tables have organized the data in a coherent and comprehensive way and revealed a large body of stylized facts that shape the discussion today, facts that are infinitely superior to the anecdotes and stories of great men that we used to have before. Let me conclude with a remark. My late Princeton colleague, Uwe Reinhardt, who died a month or so ago, used to teach accounting at Princeton, a course for which there was a vast student demand, but very little faculty supply. But Uwe loved to teach it. He was frequently asked why accounting was so important, and his answer applies even more strongly to international accounting for international organizations. He said that without accounting, there is no accountability. Without accounting, there is no accountability. If the World Bank is to achieve its dream of a world free of poverty, or to be held accountable to its member governments, it needs PPPs as a central part of its accounting. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Kristalina, and thank you, Angus. Angus is the current chair of the International Comparison Program Technical Advisory Group, and the program is very fortunate to operate under his intellectual leadership. I would like to welcome now our panelist and moderator to join Angus on stage. Our panel will discuss the importance of knowledge, data, and evidence for policymaking and sustainable development, and it would also discuss the role the ICP plays in our understanding of the world economy and welfare of its inhabitants. Angus is joined by Bob Groves, the Executive Vice President and Provost of Georgetown University. Prior to joining Georgetown, Bob was the Director of the US Census Bureau. Also on the panel is Haishan Fu, the Director of the World Bank Development Data Group and co-chair of the World Bank Development Data Council. And finally, the panel will be moderated by Shanta Devarajan, the Acting Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and the Senior Director for Development Economics. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the panel. To you, Shanta. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Nada, and thank you all for being here. This is very exciting, and after Angus's stimulating speech, we're going to have a short discussion to talk about the broader topic of data and development. And I think I'm glad that you ended with the concept of accountability, because I think data is one of the ways that we can hold politicians accountable and in many ways hold ourselves accountable. So let me start with Bob Groves. Bob, you used to run the US Census Bureau, and you've been involved in statistics extensively in the United States, and now, of course, with the International Comparison Program. So I want to ask you first, it's very clear, a cliche is to say that the data are much better in the United States and developed countries than they are in low-income countries. But I'm really wondering whether we can trust the data that we use in our PPP comparisons. I was just reading something recently that of the OECD countries, they looked at the gap between growth of GDP and growth of median income, which is another source of something that Angus has written about. And you find that just those two, the biggest gap is for the United States. Now, in this setting, if the United States has a problem with just GDP versus median income, how do we trust the data we get for PPP calculations?
Well, thank you. Let me say that I have no expertise in the ICP, but I feel like a distant cousin who's been invited to a birthday party. And I will go to any birthday party for a statistical entity, and I'm happy to be here. I'm honored to be here. Let me comment on what I think are differences between domestic and international statistics. And actually, Angus's wonderful talk went through all of them. So nothing that I say will be new, but hopefully I might say it in a slightly different way. One of the things I think that is so critical and on the surface obvious is that contrasts are of much greater value in international work than in domestic work. And those are contrasts both across time, are things getting better or worse, but also across space. Is country one doing better than country two? Now, all of these things apply in domestic statistics. I don't want to say that it isn't true, but it's a sine qua non of international work, I think. The second thing Angus and others have also said, and that is attention to distributional properties of phenomena not just totals and means and medians, are so critical. It's, in a sense, an aspect of temporal change that is very important, or spatial change, spatial differences. But as we've learned, as things have evolved, differences across subgroups is important, and distributional attributes are important. And I think most obvious are the last two things, and one has to do with harmonization. In those countries where central statistical offices design, collect, analyze, disseminate statistical information, there's a set of structures that require and oversee comparability over time, space, for the kind of statistics we create. The admirable work of ICP is to conquer comparisons when those circumstances really don't exist. And that, for that, I have deep, deep admiration. You're dealing with different measures, different entity enterprises, the constructions themselves, sometimes the constructs themselves need harmonization. And fourth, I think inherent, and Angus's talk was so wonderful on this, is how valuable in the development world these kinds of statistics are for evaluating government and other large institutional policies. So the difference or the distance between statistics as a monitoring tool, how are we doing, versus an evaluative tool, did this action, did this intervention make us better or worse, is much closer in this domain. And for those reasons, although they're only differences of a matter of degree, I think they're worthy of attention.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn to Haishan Fu, our director for the data group. Haishan, now, if Bob characterized some differences between developed and developing countries, as the data group director in the World Bank, how would you characterize differences among developing countries? And in what sense can we rely more on data from some types of countries, or what is the World Bank doing in bringing up the quality of data in some of the weaker countries?
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say I'm just really proud to have those distinguished guests with us to celebrate together this achievement of ICP over 5 decades. It's just really a great pleasure. Personally, it's a personal and a professional privilege for me to be associated with ICP, especially after joining the World Bank. To me, it's such an exciting time to be in the data business. I'm really glad to see data is being recognized as an asset both for bank, for our own work, but also for our client countries. Just in the past 3-4 years, it's great to see the governors of the bank recognize data should be a part of bank's core business, and also the Data Council of the bank received the strong support from senior management to set priorities and also to coordinate technical work. I also like to say that data is a soft infrastructure for development, and I passionately believe we need to treat it that way. There's such a great demand for better information and also high expectation that we can do better with better data and better applications. And here, I see that bank is really evolving around development data in 3 ways. One is how we do business, do data business ourselves as data and knowledge, also how we support client countries, also how we do it together in partnership with others. One thing to say that it always gave me a kick when we talk about how the bank is doing data and share knowledge. Since 2010, when we launched the open data, this statistics is really gave me a kick when I share with it. We see more than tenfold of increase in the access and use of data that bank disseminates. And every year we have almost 30 million users accessing a bank's website for that kind of information and data. So it's really wonderful for us to see this open approach help to generate better use. And we want to expand this open approach to also share the methodology, the code, the algorithm associated with those analysis and data to promote better use. And secondly, in terms of how we support countries, especially lower income countries that's facing tremendous challenges, I see that the challenge is not just a big data or small data. Well, we have such growth of data available to us. We're facing this chronic lack of information for some of the most basic development issues. Just last week, Michael Bloomberg was talking about why for 29 million people we don't know how they die, and why over 40 million people, 40 million kids have no births registered. So we just don't have that basic information that can allow us to gauge the development course. So this is where I think our support for countries must be twofold. One is to really build the foundation for those primary statistics. So this is where I'm glad, Bank has been taking the improvement of household surveys and price statistics through ICP, and well as civil registration as the fundamentals we must support countries to do. But the second front we must do is really how we can leverage new technology, new data sources to get the kind of more timely, more granular insight through innovation and data integration. And here I'm really glad to see Bank is really moving fast together with others along this way. Even through the Collaborative Innovation Fund that our group is managing, we can see real innovative collaboratives being put into place, from getting better information about refugees movement, to how the crops was being grown in the field, to integrating geospatial information with ground information to access road access, to see how the opportunities in rural areas has been improving. So there are a lot of collaborative and innovative approaches that we're promoting to really improve data. But most importantly, as Angus mentioned in his speech, the task in front of us is really huge. We can't do it alone. It has to be through collaborative partnership. And here I want to recognize, indeed, the success of the ICP so far is really because we have this huge partnership with countries and development partners and agencies, as well as experts in academia, in order to get this thing going. So we really need to look at how we should broaden those partnerships and through well thought through global initiative to really push the data agenda, so that data from many of those developing countries will be much better to inform.
Good. Thanks very much, Haishan. Angus, let me turn to you. I mean, this is a 50th birthday party, so we're celebrating and talking about all the good news. But let's be honest, right? There's always a problem with data, which is that governments don't actually invest enough in data. And I think Haishan has always been advocating this, that data is a public good, and by definition, public goods, it's very difficult to get individuals to contribute adequately towards it. But so I want to turn to Angus and ask, when you mentioned about data being a source of accountability or a tool for accountability, could that be another reason why governments don't want to invest too much in data? Because it might actually be a way of showing them up?
Well, that has been known. Yeah, I mean, I think, the word statistics has the same root as the word state. And that's really quite an important insight to think about that, because states need statistics for statecraft. And they don't just always want to suppress them, they need them. So that, when the Pilgrims came to Massachusetts in the 17th century, one of the first things they did was set up a vital registration system and count all the births and deaths, because they really cared about that. The second thing they did was found Harvard University, which is a pretty remarkable thing to do, you know, when you're still chasing away the Indians and cutting the forest down. And, you know, but I want to develop something that I think is important here, which is states have need for statistics as part of statecraft. So, you know, in the end, a country has to have a price index because it's really impossible to do lots of things that a country's need without a price index. There is no national government. Sorry, there is no international government. So just as there's a demand for statistics that comes from a nation state, that demand is much more seriously missing in the context of international data. And so the World Bank has an important role to play here, along with the United Nations and the IMF, who play the WHO and the OECD, so on, are playing a very important role in providing that data in a way that doesn't arise naturally. You know, I've been in and out of the bank as a visitor for a very long time. And when I first came here in the summer of 1980, I think, there really was no data group. There were no data. I was interested in working on household surveys. And there was a rumor that someone had once had a tape, you know, a magnetic tape of data from Sri Lanka. And we eventually found the tape behind a radiator, which was corrupted. And, you know, we tried to get the original data from Sri Lanka, but they used the tape for a subsequent survey because the tapes were valuable. And there really weren't any data at all. And I remember thinking this was a scandal then and pressing on it. And people said, but it's so expensive. And why do we need data? We know what causes development. We're going to do this thing. So, you know, the bank may not be perfect, and the ICP is not perfect, but there have been just amazing, and not only through the collection, well, first of all, the bank really started in this business by providing the WDI, which was largely a retail business, but it's supported the ICP over the years, and including in the current incarnation. And so that's a creative effort. And the bank is much more involved in creating other data sets than it used to be. But there's still an issue here, which is, I think, really worth thinking about, and it's a problem for the ICP, which is, and it puts an extra burden on the bank and on those of us who are involved in the governance of the ICP, which is there is no political repercussions if you get it wrong. So, you know, in the US, if someone screws up the CPI, heads will roll. You know, people lose their jobs. Some of you may remember the contract on America, or what was it, the contract with America? What's his name? I've forgotten his name. Anyway, who wanted to zero out the BLS if they didn't fix the price index by next week, sort of idea. And, you know, that was a horrible thing. But the real part of this is if you live in a democracy, in a government where they're using statistics, if you screw up, there's going to be democratic pressure to get it right. There's a real accountability built into the system. And that doesn't exist for the bank, and it doesn't exist for the ICP, except in Europe. And Paul and I were talking about this earlier today. The European Union calculates PPPs because they use them to redistribute funds. So they have a statecraft purpose for these numbers, and that means they're very professionally and very carefully produced. And you don't have that naturally here in the bank. So it's something that puts a huge burden on the bank and on those in charge of data in the bank and those who help run the ICP to fill in that almost ethical gap of providing data. And, you know, you started by saying, well, governments have been known to interfere in data, and there's politics interferes with data. I don't think of it that way. I think that politics always interferes with data and always should interfere with data. And that politics is deeply embedded into the structure of data. And the beginning of wisdom is to recognize that fact and to live with it and to manage it and not to pretend there's a thing such as pure data and bad politics and that they get in the way of each other. Mind you, I'm just saying this. Bob has lived with this. in the past, and he may have something much wiser to say about it than me.
Okay, let me turn to Bob then. Bob, do you have anything to add to what Angus did? But then I do want to follow up with a question going forward. And do you see that, as Angus mentioned earlier, that the work to do the PPP is very expensive? And do you see any role for modern technologies and disruptive technologies for bringing down those costs as we go forward?
So I'm not going to fall into Angus's trap that he set. Let me note that I can't remember a more exciting time to care about data than now. This is really extraordinary what we're going through. So let me tell you how I see this world. I grew up in a world where the economists or the social scientists designed measures, and we structured the measures, and we identified the units that we would measure, and we measured them, and we synthesized and analyzed the data. And the data we produced were records that were heavily multivariate, and that allowed us to do all sorts of cool modeling, and we built our careers on that. That data infrastructure was heavily dependent on the sample survey and censuses, and those in many countries of the world are under threat. One of the threats has to do, in many countries, with lower and lower participation of those units that we want to measure. And in government statistical offices' hands, that means higher costs because we just work harder and harder to try to get those measurements in. That appears to be a road that is almost at its end in some countries for some measurement purposes. That was a world that we all understood quite well, and now we have this new world. You mentioned the word disruption or disruptive. So the new world is producing data generally not designed by us. It was designed for a purpose that had nothing to do with statistical information generally. The running of an enterprise, the operation of practices that allow the production of profit or of services, whatever. Those data are really cool in one attribute. They're much more timely. They are streaming. They are real time in certain domains, something that we could never imagine before. We were used to these slow surveys and censuses, right? They're not very multivariate. They're really lean in variables, typically. We would not design the data records that we're now ingesting. We would have designed them with many more attributes. They're not controlled by us in any way. And perhaps more importantly, and this goes to Angus's point, they are created and owned by enterprises whose mission is not necessarily the public good or the common good. They have different purposes. And so they're under control of institutions that are very different than the institutions like the World Bank and national statistical offices. We have not yet navigated this new world. There are a bunch of access issues and privacy issues, but there are also a bunch of technical issues that people are working on. I think the most fascinating technical issue is, how are we going to deal with the lean in variables, rich in volume and timeliness data in concert with our traditional surveys and censuses? How are we going to blend these data together to make sense of a world where both of the sources of data are inherently fallible? We know the fallibility of them, but we have evidence that when we combine them, we may know more than we knew with each of them singly. And my admiration for ICP is that this group tackled some of those issues and tackled it in a lot of different domains. But we're headed for a completely new world. I wish I were 30 years younger right now, because it's going to be a ride.
Well, Kristalina expects all of us to be here for the 100th anniversary.
There we go.
So you'll be. So let me, actually, that's a good segue to Haishan. So Haishan, I want you to project forward 50 years. What do you think ICP is going to look like in the next half century? What's your, and you can throw in what you would like it to look like as well.
Yeah, thank you. With how the world is changing, how the disruptive technologies are converging together to change things, I wouldn't want to be the one to predict how things going to be look like in 50 years. But I do want to stress a few principles might help guide us to deal with what's coming our way. First of all, I echo what Bob just said. Indeed, there's a whole side of the world we're yet to fully understand. There are a lot of issues from privacy to confidentiality to access and the use cases of those we are still exploring. But with the increasing digitized world we're dealing with the kind of information coming to the public, we have a greater responsibility, I would say, to help to ensure is the truthful information being shared with the public to help influence public discourse to increase the understanding of development issues. While we will need to explore how those new type of data could be used, we really need to invest in how to make the basic data right so that we have some fundamentals we can ground truth. Those are the information at the same time to open up the possibility to integrate some of this data to provide more timely and granular insight. Normally, we currently do not see yet fully available. So here, looking at ICP, I think its longer-term success will depend on how we can build upon the past 50 years, but address few things immediately in the next few years. One is about how we can expand ICP's good work in building capacities in countries, especially currently countries that are in fragile conflict situation, have been excluded and very irregular in participating in this global exercise. So we will need to really find better ways to support them to develop the capacity to be in this process. Secondly, we will need, this is a complex project, Angus alluded to that. There are a lot of issues that we are yet to find answers. We will need to be really much more courageous in exploring new type of information, new approaches that new technology render us to see whether we can solve some of the problems with cheaper, faster, better result. And third, I really believe the real value of this huge undertaking, as you said, is costly. Its return is really in its real use that will really help influence real development policies. And here, I really want to see the producers of ICP will connect more with users and policymakers and really put the use and the broader, more potential use of ICP at our heart so that we can really see how things could evolve from now currently comparing the size of economies, perhaps to going deeper to look at within country, sub-regional or group differences to address the issue of inequality, to look at how we can assess more sectoral issues. This morning, Angie said, in the sector, how we really evaluate health expenditure and costs has yet to mature into a better approach. Perhaps our future approach would help guide that. And at the same time, we also need to learn how to transform this complex set of PPPs into more easily understandable and useful statistics. Angus, today, again, you gave us an idea. Could we go beyond the current ICP result and learn from the big max to see how we can help influence some of the other uses of ICP in a way that's much easier to understand and apply?
Okay, I want to go to the audience for questions, but I have one last question for Angus, which is, as you mentioned in your speech, data, at least in the World Bank, we also use data to promote development. Now, what are the 2 or 3 things that we could be doing better to make data more effective in promoting development?
Oh, that's a hard question. I mean, I think actually that the bank has, as I said earlier, made enormous strides in systematically collecting data and making it available to the world, initially on a low cost and now on a no cost basis. So that's a tremendous public service. I think there's another part of the agenda which is much harder and less work has been done, and I think enormous needs to be done, is improving the statistical capacity within countries or helping them to do that. So, you know, we spent yesterday afternoon talking with Chico and the poverty people, and a lot of the household surveys that are used for calculating poverty numbers, we don't even really know what's in them or how they were designed or what's with them. And you know, it's not our business to tell countries what data to collect, and I think there's a big problem there. The SDGs and the ICP are putting a lot of pressure on countries to collect data that may not be their own first priority. And that somehow gets in the way of what seems to me the key goal, which is that many countries don't have their own data for their own purposes, which is well enough developed. And the bank has been reluctant, I think, to make the investments that would be needed. I mean, it's not entirely true. There's been a lot of help here and there. And the ICP in itself, by saying, you know, if you're going to give that to us, you need to do this better, has often helped them with, and there were lots of things in the video of examples where countries had done that, but we need more of that. So national accounts and household surveys within the countries are something that I think should be on the bank's agenda in the near future.
Okay, thanks very much. Okay, now we've been speaking to you. Now this is your chance to speak back to us. So let me open it up for questions from the audience. The only requirement is to please come to the microphone that's in the center there, the one with the red band, because this is, as Nada mentioned, this is being live streamed.
That was a fascinating discussion and very inspiring. One question I wanted to ask relates to not just measuring the overall level of economic activity in countries, but also the distribution. And we've talked about that a little bit so far in terms of poverty at the very bottom of the distribution. But of course, one of the phenomena of recent decades in both the developed and developing world has been a more general growth in inequality within countries. And so GDP per capita might be misleading about what's happening in different parts of the distribution. And I wondered whether that was something that the ICP wanted to push more on, to sort of think about how we think about how the whole distribution of individuals within a country is changing, and so how the world individual income inequality distribution is evolving.
Do you want to take that, Angus?
It's obviously not a strength of the ICP. I mean, the ICP was conceived as a national income accounting exercise which would have comparable units across countries. And, you know, the distributional data have got to come from other sources. So the ICP is a price collection exercise plus national accounts. And so it's not the obvious place to start for the distributional data. The distributional data in some ways are easier because with a good household survey and with some sort of assumptions about everybody facing the same price, you can say a lot about distribution within and across countries without having to make the ICP type corrections. But I think there's long been more interest in inequality within poor countries, and that the interest in inequality in rich countries is a somewhat more recent. You know, when Shanta and I were young, we used to worry a lot about inequality in India or inequality in China and inequality in Brazil, and where no one was really worried very much about inequality in the US or in Europe, for example.
Chico.
Thanks very much to Angus and the panel for a very nice session so far. I was struck by something that Bob said, by the contrast between the contrast he drew between this rich multivariate design service, now under threat from non-response issues and selection and so on, and big data designed, you know, by companies for other purposes, but often with a thin set of covariates to go along with income. And I was struck by the fact that I was at a workshop just last week where a number of people, including Thomas Piketty, were saying, look, the future is neither of those. The future is registries. The sort of administrative data that the Scandinavians have. The sort of very rich multivariate administrative data that many people outside of Scandinavia or France or other countries is afraid of, because it sort of reminds people of a big brother type of government that knows everything about you. But that's data that's both big, comprehensive in its coverage, and incredibly rich in its covariates. Now, one of the things that people from the World Bank who were at that conference were saying was, well, for the poor countries, that's so far away into the future, and we're still trying to get them to collect household surveys. But maybe that's not true. Maybe we can leapfrog. Maybe there is a possibility of using registry data more. So my question to the panel was, what about that kind of data?
Bob?
So let me take a shot at this first. Well, that is the registered data is the future in Scandinavia. I agree with that. I think there are two things that are just fundamentally different now. They are cultural. They're not statistical. We now know about how completely conjoined, merged together data sets become targets. The future that I see is not that one in every country of the world. If you want to have fun one weekend with nothing to do, go back into the archives of Congress in the 1960s when there was a national data center proposed. It was that image. It was just, a social scientist's dream. Let's get every record on everyone in the United States, link it together, and think of what good we could do. I believe the most memorable congressional comment from the floor was, if this bill passes, within 5 years, someone is going to tell my daughter whom to marry. I have no idea what logic led him to that conclusion. But so we've just finished. There are two things that happened in the United States: this Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking that Paul Ryan and Patty Murray did, and then the National Academies just finished a 2-volume set on multiple data sources. Both of those, thinking of the U.S. culture, said, even though we need to build a data world that merges together data records, we don't want a data warehouse of everyone's record merged together. And so using modern computing techniques, I think we'll get to a world where we won't have registers in that sense. We will have, it's a Permanent Employment Act for statisticians. We're going to have to model our way through data that were not designed to be conjoined. I don't see any way out of this. And it's a really messy data world. I don't see any way out of this. It would be a lot easier to become like Sweden and Denmark and Norway. But culturally, I just don't see it happening in countries like the United States, and each of us could speculate on different cultures, how far away we are.
Haishan, did you want to add to that?
I do believe there's huge potential for leapfrogging. Because so far, I think we have always looked at improving data and data capacity as a siloed investment. But right now, with the kind of digital technology that's available and fast evolving, I do believe we need to consider parallel investment in digital development, and that create the digital economy and digitize the government system, allow data to be generated in different way than what we know now in many, at least less developed countries. It has to be based on survey just because we don't have the regular registration and other digitized data system allow us to see the different kind of data flows. But there's a lot of issues that we'll need to manage in this process, which are great. But I do see we do have the technological solution, but we'll need to be very creative and mindful at the same time to steer towards this development. But I do want to mention two other points. One is to respond to Angus' recall for you coming to the bank without access to the survey data. This happened to be in someone's floppy disk. I just want to let you know, last year, we launched a World Bank Development Data Hub, which is the first comprehensive data catalog, allows staff to document and share and access all kinds of data, be it trend data or microdata or geospatial data, which provide this platform for much better use of data. So not only data will be deposited, but also you can share your analysis, your code behind your analysis alongside with the data, which will be really much more productive for us to tap into the potential of data. Second point is about the access and open data principle we really need to push for. I think there's so much more opportunity for the ICP data to be used for different purposes. At the same time, by having it accessible and open will allow us to have more opportunity to improve the quality of the data. I think these two come hand in hand, and we really should not let it go unstressed.
Can't resist a couple of words about big data. You know, in some ways, I'm glad I'm old and I will not have to live in this world. And I think that one of the things that we old people owe our successors is that, you know, concepts like GDP and consumption and the national accounts were evolved for a really good reason. And there's a danger they'll be swept away by inferior big data substitutes that people find convenient. And I think, you know, one of the things we don't do much anymore is we don't train our students in what national accounts are. And so even people who really ought to know often don't know at all. The threats of big data are really real, and all you have to do is follow the current data, the current trends in India and the universal identification things there. And, you know, the over-enthusiastic application of these things and the belief by people sitting in rich parts of India that people sitting in poor parts of India can use the same technology that they can, with the results of people actually dying by not getting access to food, for example, that's guaranteed to them under the welfare state. So there's a lot of sort of gung-ho-ness about this that has to be pulled back a little bit. There are also very, very serious issues in India about privacy and about security and government control. But, you know, I agree with Bob, but it's very interesting. I mean, in France, where data were used during the war to round up people and send them to their deaths, they have an incredibly strict code so that not even the head of the statistical office can merge data sets across different items. In Holland, where data were used for exactly the same purpose, everyone's allowed to merge everything with everything, and no one seems to mind about it very much. So, you know, these cultural norms, I don't think, are clear or necessarily permanent. But as an example, it's not quite a counterexample, but if you look at what Raj Chetty has been doing, you know, Raj Chetty went and persuaded Jack Lew to give him access to the 50 million income tax records in the US, and then merged them into the National Death Index, and he's now been merging them into the census, and so on. These are not complete merges, and there's still real problems with skinniness, so that, for instance, you may not know what race people are because it's not on the income tax records, or you may not know whether they've ever been in jail because that's not in the census and stuff like that. But nevertheless, I mean, those are very, very big data efforts that are coming sort of close to approaching traditional social science questions that would normally, so there's a lot of scope, but I also think that's scary too. I'm not entirely sure.
Go ahead.
one thing that hasn't been said, this is not the time for us to be modest on one thing we know. And I think this community is unusually wise about not trusting data. We scrutinize data. We never believe it. We beat it up. We massage it. We make sure that it is what we think it is before we do anything. And one of the fears, and it's related to what you're saying, are we training the next generation of people who are going to be handling data with those deep values that I think are very important?
Just very quickly, it's okay. I do believe the cautionary notes that you are putting forward. Indeed, they're deep embedded values and principles that the digital community committed to and will need to uphold. And at the same time, I also believe as a community, we also need to have a bit more courage to embrace certain risk while be very cautious and mindful about how to manage some of those. I just want to mention the World Bank's initiative Identification for Development. It's clearly recognizing the potentials of digital ID could offer to people, especially poor people, but take the initiative, work with other partners to develop a clear set of principles will integrate considerations for security and privacy and other potential abuse that we will need to manage and avoid into the initiative, therefore, to really ensure that we keep a right balance in leveraging the potential while managing the risk, but not to let it go without proper reflection.
Okay. Yeah, I think we only have time for one more because we have to.
One more, coming back to the question of administrative data versus big data versus survey data. I think in the future we need to be creative and have a lot of fantasy to imagine that the solution for the future is not fitting to this old, let's say, classification. Because I simply think that this asymmetry between the private sector, which already is using a kind of full register of all the knowledge of merged data, and the public sector, which is very humble and cautious, is not the concept for the future. Looking at the way the European countries, for example, will conduct the population census around 2021, you see a variety of solutions. And I think this variety of solutions will address the respective cultural condition, but it is a solution in each country which is a merger of big data, administrative data, and survey data. So we are already on the way, and I would really be cautious to use the old, let's say, classical discussions we have had in the 1960s for the concepts of the future. Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to take that?
I agree. I agree. And you know, there is a speculation, or I'll speculate, that this notion of fitness for use, which we've always kind of had sitting out there, but we've never really known what we mean by that, I think. I speculate that that's going to rise in our attention, because I don't see generalized solutions for the combination of these different data sources. There will be use-specific optimal combinations. And so we're going to start talking about, is it good enough for a particular use? And we've never, the one weakness of the old world is the statisticians, the government statistician, determined how good was good enough for an infinite number of uses. And that world is gone, I think.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks. I think we've reached we're going to transition to the next phase. So, Nada.
So thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you very much, Shanta, for moderating this very lively discussion. As Angus mentioned in his keynote, back in 1968 at the University of Pennsylvania, the ICP was founded by 3 scholars, the late Irving Kravitz, the late Robert Summers, and Alan Heston, who's with us today. For today's milestone occasion, Larry Summers, who is the son of Robert Summers, shared with us a tribute message in memory of his father, which we will play shortly. Larry does not need much introduction. He's the President Emeritus of Harvard University, the 71st Secretary of the US Treasury, the former Director of the US National Economic Council, and former Chief Economist of the World Bank. So let us hear Larry together.
My name's Larry Summers. Only the graduation of one of my children would keep me away from the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the ICP. I remember as a 14-year-old child the inception of the ICP, and my father explaining to me how he, along with Irv Kravis, who was leading the project, and Al Heston were going to be involved in comparing prices across countries. I remember his patiently explaining to me that you couldn't just use the exchange rate to make the comparison, because after all, a price of toothpaste and certainly the price of a month's rent might be different in France and in the United States. And I remember his talking about the effort to acquire data from 10 countries and to make a set of comparisons. Over time, as my capacity to absorb sophisticated economic analysis increased and the complexity of the project increased, I remember talking with my dad principally, but also with Irv Kravis and Al Heston about the issue of the index number problem and what international prices one should use. I remember my father explaining to me, it took several tries, the Geary-Kamas technique. I remember as an undergraduate economics student talking to my father as he was thinking through the problem of missing data and how to fill in prices for goods that didn't exist as in a data problem, or prices that in some sense were irrelevant, as in the price of heating oil in Kenya. I remember even as a college student being struck by the complexity of this undertaking, but also being impressed by the importance of this undertaking. It's been said many times that what you count counts, that what you measure is ultimately something that is very, very important for what gets the focus of leaders, of policymakers, of others. And so this effort at statistics will surely for some be an insomnia cure, but for many others will produce a product that helps us understand the world better, and once we understand the world, helps make the world better. I don't think Irv or Al or my dad in 1968 could have envisioned today's international comparison project. They couldn't have imagined the volume of the data that would be collected. They couldn't have imagined the extent of the computing power and the sophistication that would go into the processing of the data. They couldn't have imagined the size of the research community that would use the data. They couldn't have imagined, and given how it acted in the early days, that's perhaps understandable, the central role that the World Bank would be enthusiastically playing in supporting the International Comparison Project. They couldn't have imagined that purchasing power parity-based comparisons of income and living standards would become the coin of the international realm on these dialogues. They couldn't have imagined that official statistical atlases would highlight purchasing power parity numbers, that aggregates calculated by the international financial institutions would be driven by purchasing power parity numbers. And they certainly couldn't have imagined that policy dialogues on questions relating to everything from energy and income to the economic determinants of fertility, to the measurement of global poverty, to the calculation of the global income distribution, to judging how well economic systems were doing in producing living standards, would come to be driven by what had come out of a small acorn of statistical work laid at the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1960s. It's been a great privilege for me as Robert Summers' son, as Irv Kravis and Al Heston's friend, as a one-time chief economist of the World Bank, as an economic researcher, and as a senior American policymaker, to see what I think is one of the most important global public goods that has been produced over the last 50 years, the International Comparison Program, and all the statistics that have come with it. It's traditional on a 50th birthday to talk about 50 more years. And that is very much what we can expect. But ultimately, with something like statistical work, part of what is most important is when it ceases to be seen as an enormous accomplishment or even as something worthy of comment, but just becomes part of normal life. So it is with the Consumer Price Index in the United States. So it is with the GDP growth statistics for most individual countries. And so it is with purchasing power parity-based international comparisons. And so yes, I look for the growth and strengthening of the ICP, but in many ways, I look for its routinization and its acceptance as part of global economic life. And that routinization and acceptance is perhaps its ultimate triumph, what we should celebrate today, and what we should look to see even further in the years ahead. Thank you very much for the chance to be with you.
And that takes us to the last part and most important part of our program, actually. I wanted to start by sharing with you one of my own ICP memories. I attended my first ICP meeting here at the World Bank in 2004. My ex-boss, Fred, is here, and I think he remembers that meeting. It was a very lively discussion. I recall at the meeting a soft-spoken man who seemed to be always deep in thought. Yet every time he would make a statement or an intervention, everyone listened with deference. So I wondered, who is that person? And I asked my colleagues, and they told me that is Alan Heston, the co-founder of the program. To date, to all of us who have known Alan throughout the year, he remains the most respected ICP authority with a sharp, inquisitive mind, but the humility of a true scholar. He is a true mentor to all of us, young and old, and a wealth of knowledge that continues to guide the next generation of ICP experts. So on behalf of all this wide ICP community that extends way beyond the World Bank to all the countries, to around 200 countries, and to many of his colleagues who are here today, we want to celebrate today 50 years of your achievements, Alan, and contributions to knowledge in general and international comparisons in particular. So we have a small token of appreciation, which we wanted to present to you today, and which summarizes your ICP life in photos. So please join me in welcoming Alan. Just something for you to remember us by, actually. Thank you.
Well, this is a hard act to follow, but I will not try to look in the future. I'm going to start with the past. I'm going to go before the 50th year, before 1968. This is a background for the sort of technology that was around then, the way we entered data, the way we entered code. But the real start of these comparisons is in the 1930s, when national accounting was started, and with the work of Colin Clark, who in 1940 published his Conditions of Economic Progress. Simon Kuznets had two students at the University of Pennsylvania who were PhD students, Milton Gilbert and Irving Kravis. Irving Kravis was to stay at Penn. Milton Gilbert took the job of heading statistics at the present-day OECD. Gilbert asked Kravis to join him in a comparison which was quite appropriate for the time, when there basically no one knew what the real purchasing power was of any of the European countries. And so they started out with bilateral comparisons with the US of Italy, France, Germany, and the UK. And this set of binary comparisons was quite well received. And I'd like to point out two people who were at the OECD at the time. One is, this is Angus Madison's 65th celebration at the University of Groningen. And he wasn't associated with the ICP at the time, but was very concerned with and associated with the people there. The other is the white vest, far left, Wilfred Beckerman, who did shortcut comparisons of income and also worked with Gilbert on the ICP. When the ICP started in '68, there was, it was committed to either productivity comparisons or expenditure side comparisons of the national accounts. In fact, what they chose to do was what Kravis was familiar with. They chose the expenditure side. And I wanted to show Madison's picture particularly because he was always a production side person. The group of Penn people who were associated with the project, some of these pictures you've seen before, I had hair then, as they noticed. Irv Kravis is the far left. The families are around, but two people I'd like to point out who were crucial in phase one. Sultan Ahmed, who is next between Kravis and myself, who came on to work at the World Bank in this ICP work, and the lady whose face got sort of faded out here, Alicia Civitello, who became a real price expert and worked at the UN in their post-adjustment work. Penn was more or less very inefficient in turning out results, very slow, and because we had it easy then and did the data, we were not always appreciated by participating countries at using their data and the speed with which we used it. So after the 1975 comparison, the ICP was regionalized. And so this left idle time for some of us. And we began to experiment with the Penn World Tables, which has been alluded to. And oh, I left out that one, didn't I? Yes, okay. As part of the ICP group, this was a Bellagio meeting, and I'll just where Kravis and Summers are, and in the picture I showed before, Bob was taking the picture, so he wasn't in it. And we have Sultan Ahmed, Peter Hill next to him on the couch, who was instrumental in getting this work done at the OECD, started at the OECD. Yuri Ivanov is in the far left up there, who was instrumental in the projects I should have mentioned about the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, who did comparisons in the 1960s too. And the gentleman more or less underneath the picture is Hugo Krentz-Locher, who is instrumental in the EU in this work. So we spent time in doing this work that Angus alluded to, the 100-country paper and the ICP. And again, the technology of how this data got distributed initially was in diskettes in a journal, which students stole from the libraries. So it wasn't that successful unless they shared it with other people. When we were doing this work, we sought an economic consultant to help us. The fellow on the left, Benjamin Franklin, was our constant companion. Bob and I are there, and Bettina Atten and Dan Nuxall, who worked on the ICP with us for some time. Parallel to this, Angus Madison's group at Groningen were working on, Madison founded the ICOP, or the International Comparisons of Productivity, and we have two of his successors who've been alluded to. Robert Enkler on the right, and Marcel Timmer on the left, who were now, along with Rob Finstra, in back of my bald head, worked together to take over PWT, for which I am eternally grateful. I'm going to turn now to the path of the ICP. The video was very nice, but what it did was show that a very smooth process was taking place in the ICP from throughout all the rounds. I can assure you it, as Larry's comments also suggested, it was not a very smooth process. And there was not great acceptance of this work necessarily. There were two tipping points, three perhaps. The PPPs began to be adopted in textbooks and by journalists, which took 20 or 30 years, and still not always adopted. The economic growth literature, which Angus alluded to, was another tipping point because at that time most of this work was actually done with PWT data, and the main tipping point was the IMF, which produces the world growth rates, and in the period of the Asian miracle and the rapid growth in Japan, and the very slow growth in Europe at the time, you had this paradox that the world was growing very slow because Europe had great weight at exchange rates, and Asia had low weight at exchange rates. And they wanted to capture world growth more appropriately. So they changed to PPP-based magnitudes to weight the growth rates around the world. Well, that, I think, kind of turned the tide. There was several commissions to try to report on the efficacy of the World Bank, and despite the fact that one of them at least was intended to end the project, not at the World Bank, but both studies said that the ICP should go on, despite all its faults, of which there were many. We showed the birthday cake, and this was the 40th anniversary of the ICP. I'm not sure what kind of cake we're going to get now, but this set of comments, which was what was provided to me, was much better than that cake, I can assure you. I would end just by saying that for me, it's bittersweet having lost so many people, but gratifying that the younger generation is taking over. There's a lot of enthusiasm in countries. They're very bright and well trained compared to what they were. So I leave this project in its 50 years and hope it goes on well, but have no regrets leaving.
Thank you very much, all of you in audience, as well as online, for joining us in this event. Thank you very much to our speakers, to our moderator, to our panelists. I want to also acknowledge, finally, many former and current ICP Technical Advisory Group members who are in audience today. Erwin Dewart, anyone who knows anything about index numbers know who Erwin is. Prasada Rao, Walter Radermacher, Fred Vogel, Kim Zishang, Mick Silver, Paul Schreier, Robert Feenstra, Robert Hill, Bettina Atten, and Sen Chu Chu. We thank you very much for your contributions to the program. We hope that the ICP will continue to produce more and better data for years to come. And as Kristalina said, maybe in another 50 years, another generation of ICPers would celebrate the 100th anniversary of the program. Please stay with us and join us for a reception in the atrium. We don't have cake, but we have spring rolls, Alan.
Just words of thanks to Nada, who made it all happen. She said organizing this was twice as hard as organizing her wedding. So you have some idea of how hard this was. Thank you.